Eric, we have to come out strong for this episode.
If you're going to come out, it better be strong.
You know what? There is stronger by what?
Stronger by
Scientology.
Yes.
Those that don't want to hear the banter, you're out of luck today. You can skip 5 or 10 minutes ahead. It is your loss. But I will say very quickly that we have to address the recent controversy surrounding Stronger by Scientology, in that they hosted for the first ever time, Eric, a live video podcast. For those unaware, they have been our rivals for quite some time. They were our longtime ally, apparently, kind of like Eurasia and East Asia. It's hard to keep track these days with, the shifting sands of political intrigue. Nonetheless, they had an audio podcast. Everyone knows Eric and myself are atop the pyramid, naked, flexing, holding hands together. Video podcasts are our domain. Up come these upstarts doing a video podcast that I am quoting Trexler now. He said it's actually an immersive multimedia experience, not a video podcast, because he knew we would come at them, because that's our thing. And they had the audacity, they had the goal to go ahead and do this, Eric, and they thought we wouldn't notice. And I just want to say very quickly that it was clear to me how terrible their setup is, where they didn't prepare in advance. They said, we're going to do a live Q&A, like a live Q&A. So they didn't have any content prepared. They were leveraging their audience essentially to try and create content. And we're just not about that life.
No, and this is, you guys can see the politics that's involved in the podcast game. Mm-hmm. I'm not even sure our timeline was correct that you described of our status with Stronger by Science. I think we started out as general friends because we were in the same domain, and then they quickly became mortal enemies.
Yep.
And then we became and always were allies from that point forward once we united against one unnamed serial killer named Danny Lennon. Yeah, you heard that right. An unnamed serial killer named Danny Lennon. And and now I'm not going to say we're back to being enemies because, Danny's still out there stalking the night. But I will say that tensions are high. Mm-hmm. Our ambassadors right now in Stronger by Science land are packing up because they might get recalled. We're not full-blown Cold War, but we're definitely in a position where we're considering sanctions, and I'm sure they're being considered against us. All I can say is let's just hope it doesn't boil over further. But I will point out that we do stand strong as far as maybe we even stand stronger. Maybe we even stand strongest in our principles.
Yep.
Which is that we're always going to be prepared. You guys have heard it every time we brought a guest on. They get to speak immediately. We give them the floor. Mm-hmm. They clearly know what we brought them on for. They're never surprised. We don't do improvisation here.
No.
You should see how much time Omar and I spend writing down, the banter. Really,
yeah.
It's scripted, and we even script in, slip ups, and all just to make it sound natural,
like we're human. All. Yeah.
Yes.
Relatable.
Like something like that. I mean, we do our best to try to understand what that's like. Often failing just because we're so far above that standard, but nonetheless, it's a carefully orchestrated. Orchestra that we're orchestrating. And that type of thing right there that I just did, scripted, okay?
Yeah.
That's not just me off the top failing to find synonyms, all right, folks? That is the cinnamon spice to the pumpkin latte that is Iron Culture. So just sit back, enjoy it, and know that we're never going to go that cheap route of just trying to appeal to the visual masses without actually having the content to back it up. When we do Q&A episodes, what do? We use the difficult challenge of posting on our Instagram story, hey, got any questions?
Yeah.
And then checking it a few hours later. And then, remembering that. And hopefully checking it within 24 hours so the story doesn't disappear so we forget what the questions were. So there's a lot that goes into what we do, folks. And you can skip past the banner, but just know that you're skipping past a lot of the best content, really.
And quite frankly, the content we spend the most time on, that whole orchestrated, that's about 40 hours of script writing between Eric and myself just for that one little segment. The research, the other stuff, the rigid research that goes into everything, Eric, to find the questions, vet the individuals, make sure there's utility in the questions. Anyone can do that, okay? A robot, a rogue AI could even do that. So unlike their very unstructured Q&A that was live, we have something perfectly formatted for your experience that's directly relevant to your goals. This is another Iron Culture Q&A. And they could come at us. Eric, we're used to people coming at us, right? And I feel safe stating that out loud.
No, I mean, sometimes we've been battered down. We were standing. Next thing you know, Omar's on his knees, and people and men are just surrounding him, coming at him, and he's just fending his hands off like this, just trying to stop.
Doing a double bicep.
Yeah, hitting a double bicep while the men are trying to come at him, and he just won't let them keep him down. I mean, he stays down on his knees because, you know, he fights best from that position. A lot of experience, but he does not. He hasn't stayed down, you know, in terms of his motivation.
Where
he's
are
still
you this whole
motivated
time,
down.
Eric?
You know, someone's got to film this so that we can make sure that people know how the haters are real. You know, people are coming at Omar.
You're like, I'm if you're on your knees, I'm lying down. I'm like, oh God, we really have no hope here. It's like, Eric, you're like, I'm playing dead. I'm hoping they don't notice me. I'm like, what?
I'm absolutely pulling a possum. Exactly.
What's the stat I heard about possums? Where they could stay in that position, like prone, for, I heard an absurd amount, like 8-12 hours, a very long time.
That's hibernation status almost, I tell you what.
Yeah, they're just waiting for the trauma to go away. Whereas I'm trying to normalize it by making it seem like a bodybuilding show, right?
And it's not a bodybuilding show.
It's not this is not what we signed up for. But with that being said, we can now begin. We fulfilled our contractual obligations for the banter, because there's that virulent segment that if we don't, I receive the threats. So we can ask these questions, and keep in mind we don't boldly declare here stronger by anything, because we know we're the strongest. So we don't limit ourselves just to powerlifting or strength training. And one of the first questions is kind of relevant for that, Eric, as it relates to movements and selecting technical proficiency or the technical form. This person essentially wants to know, is there a difference in terms of technical execution one must do if they're aiming to build muscle versus getting stronger? And I think I'll give an example to you, Eric, maybe just to set this up. Let's say someone is doing the bench press, right? And they want to maximize it. This is a very common question. They want to maximize it for hypertrophy. So maybe let's give two clear examples to elucidate this. One person wants to get stronger, so we know they're going to always try and maximize that efficiency, get technical proficiency up there. We can answer that question. But then for hypertrophy, is mechanical load most important? Is it the amount of weight they'll be lifting? So should they have a very similar technical setup if their goal is purely hypertrophy? Because we get in that quagmire where we start talking power building, where we mix some of the goals. Let's just distinguish it like that. How should someone technically execute a lift if their goal is strength focused versus hypertrophy?
I think that's a great question, and there's a couple of different subtopics here to talk about.
Yeah.
So one is understanding what level of neuromuscular proficiency you need to be able to actually provide a muscular overload. Because as we've all experienced, if we go back to the first time we started doing movements, and not even incredibly complex movements, but just say like a leg press, like figuring out where to hold it, where to put your feet, how deep to go, angle of your toes, you know, based on your own like hip structure and range of motion, how do I keep my back on the pad, etc. There's a learning process. And you know, even nowadays when I go from like a leg press to a new leg press I've never done, I'm adding like plates on each side the next time I do it, because I'm actually figuring out the movement. And that level of quick increase in force production, you know, scales with the complexity of the movement, you know. So the first time you're trying to do a snatch properly, it's probably a dowel, you know, then it's a bar. And then very quickly you're looking at, you know, 50, 60, 70% of your body weight within like the first year of training the snatch, you know, and that's a really large relative increase. Same thing with squats, which is something that most people can probably relate to. The unfortunate thing is during that learning phase, you're probably not providing enough of a stimulus to actually grow. So what we don't want if our goal is hypertrophy is to follow like an extreme version of the muscle confusion principle. Like, oh, we always got to do something, make it feel new. Like, no, like we don't want it to feel that new. You want to have a level of proficiency with an exercise so that you can actually overload it. And this has been shown in research. There's a study on untrained women where they have them train for 12 weeks and they had them do bench press, leg press, and bicep curls. I think I've mentioned this study before, so I won't spend a ton of time on it. But they did pre, mid, and post testing for cross-sectional area or muscle thickness. I can't remember which one. And then also 1RM strength. And 1RM strength increased at every single time point, right? So they're getting those quick adaptations from pre to mid, and then they're continuing to get stronger from mid to post. So bench press, curl, and leg press all go up. However, hypertrophy was only observed in the biceps at the midpoint. So the compound lifts, where you're actually trying to figure out intra and intramuscular coordination and figuring out how to do those, we saw increases in strength from just kind of figuring out the movement, but there wasn't necessarily quadricep or pectoralis major. There was no trunk changes in lean mass until the end. So the idea there is that, okay, by the 12-week mark, these untrained people were able to actually get the coordination necessary to actually overload. So one thing we want to avoid is not being good at a movement. So when you think about, technical considerations only being for strength, I don't think that's accurate. And of course, I'm straw manning what someone might be thinking, but I think because of that concept of muscle confusion, there are some people out there who probably don't get the level of proficiency they need, or they don't think of technical execution as an important factor for hypertrophy. So that's one thing to consider. Essentially, what you want is consistency in execution. However, on the other side of it, and this is that second tangent, for strength, you are all about specificity. So strength is not just a quality of the body, but it's also a skill. Being able to put yourself in the best position to lift the most weight within the context of a movement requires you to understand the context of that movement. So for example, sometimes you hear that, that powerlifter only got one white light and not 2 or 3, and the lift didn't pass because he or she cut depth. Well, why did they cut depth? Well, because if you're traveling through a shorter range of motion, you can typically lift more weight. So a power lifter sometimes, depending on how good they are at bouncing out of the hole, what their hip morphology is, what type of range of motion they have, it's not uncommon for them to try to reduce range of motion to increase load. That's why you see an arch in the bench press. That's why you see some people with the right anthropometrics and hip structure and arm length choose to do a sumo deadlift rather than a conventional, right? They're trying to reduce range of motion to increase load. So they are working within the requirements of their sport for the technical execution of that movement. So there are specific rules that they can't surpass. Like, okay, I can't actually lift my butt off the bench and get even less range of motion, but how do I get the maximum amount of arch, right? I can't go wider than the rings with my fingers, but I can go max grip legal width in the bench press to try to lift more. Now, that sometimes puts them in a position where that technique may not be ideal for hypertrophy, but it does allow them to acutely improve strength or be stronger, probably is a better way to put it. So like we know there's a relationship between muscle size and strength. So if you have someone who has a fantastic arch and does a max legal width grip position, and they only have, say, a 3-inch range of motion, and there are some extreme outliers and, say, like highly flexible people in lower weight classes, you can see some very impressive lightweight lifters who have an extremely short range of motion on bench because they've got a great arch and the right limb lengths and mobility. However, if you think about it, the pecs are still a prime mover when you're doing a bench press, even if it's a short range of motion. And we know that training muscles at long muscle lengths through a full range of motion generally results in greater hypertrophy. So a really good movement for powerlifters who have a technique which allows them to greatly reduce range of motion are other variations which increase range of motion. So feet up bench press, for example, so you eliminate the arch, right? Or a deficit deadlift for someone who pulls in a way that it really reduces their range of motion. A high bar squat, as an example. So I think there are considerations for long-term strength development and then what will acutely improve my performance right now on the platform. And a powerlifter needs to know when to utilize each, and they should be trying to maximize the constraints of the movement according to the rule book in order to be as strong as possible in any acute given situation. For hypertrophy, though, like I said, you want to train at long muscle lengths, and you also want to be consistent. So you really should be adapting the range of motion to your body. So for example, you want to squat as deep as you can, not to an arbitrary depth standard. So that might mean, a bodybuilder with poor mobility is squatting as deep as they can, but might not hit meet depth. And sure, they're going to get flamed in the YouTube comments, but they shouldn't be squatting deeper if it results in them losing the position that they want at all their various joints, like their lower back position or keeping their heels on the floor, etc. So for hypertrophy, you want consistency, proficiency, and using the range of motion, which results in the training at the longest muscle length you can without actually moving out of a safe position or a position that you're used to or have control over. You also want to think about the control of the eccentric and the concentric. So for example, if you're performing deadlift to lift as much as possible for, say, a 3-rep max, you're probably not going to control the eccentric of rep 1 and rep 2 because it just adds fatigue, right? So you just drop it while holding onto it. If you think about the movement demands like the IPF standard, you just have to show control over the bar. You don't have to slowly lower it. Basically, just don't lose grip and you can let it slam on the ground, and that's fine. That's a legal lift. And if you're trying to lift the most you can for a given set, you don't want to induce any extra fatigue. So like I said, that triple might be a concentric drop, a concentric drop, a concentric drop, right? However, for a bodybuilder who, let's say they're using deadlifts as a part of the lower body training day, let's say you got a set of 5, you should exert some control over the eccentric so that it's actually continuing to provide tension so that you're not actually performing half of the reps. That eccentric factor is just as important as the concentric when you're lifting. So you need to be basically under muscular control of the movement at all times. That doesn't mean intentionally slowing things down necessarily, but I would argue that yes, it could move faster if you let gravity do the work, but you should be the one doing the work. So generally, those are the things I would advise in terms of thinking about technique for hypertrophy and technique for strength. And I've been talking a lot about compound movements. A secondary thing to think about is your secondary movements. So people talk a lot about the quote unquote mind-muscle connection. And I think that is a thing, don't get me wrong, but you probably don't want to be thinking about individual muscles when you're doing a compound movement. Because that's just not how movement works. Like when you climb a tree, you don't think, all right, let me flex my hip. Let me flex my shoulder, let me flex the elbow, and I'll simultaneously do that on the other side of my body, but they'll be in a contralateral position. Yeah, that's a great way to fall off a tree. We look for outcomes in movement, and our body figures out how to get there, right? And that's basically how we should think about compound movements. How do I do this movement properly? You want to use external cues. You want to think about the overall completion of it. Don't worry about whether your quads are getting a stimulus on a squat. If you manage to stand up, your quads did something. That's just the way knee extension works. However, if you're doing something like a isolated knee extension or a bicep curl or some machine-based back work, I think strapping up, thinking about actually feeling your lat contract and really thinking about the mind-muscle connection and slowing down the tempo a little bit and being very intentional with your movement, I think that does make sense when you're trying to isolate movements, or not that we really fully isolate muscle groups, but when we're trying to emphasize a given muscle group in a movement more than another. But I think we need to be aware of what are good candidates for exercises for focusing on the mind-muscle connection. And most of the time, it's not lower body compounds. It's not compound movements in general, but it is some machine-based compounds, primarily for the back, where it's actually people struggle often just anecdotally in their mind-muscle connection, and definitely for isolation movements, be that calf raises, tricep pushdowns, bicep curls, a lat pushdown, leg extension, leg curl, etc.
Eric, that is a monster answer. I want to know, because you said consistency, proficiency, the role that personal preference plays, because I want to get back to the hypertrophy angle. I think people are acutely aware when we talk about strength and, the goals, what one needs to do or what you need to focus on. But I'll give 2 different scenarios to put them kind of at the opposite ends of the spectrum. If one's goal is hypertrophy, the consideration of personal preference. So let's say they have solid mobility. They can do a high bar squat to, when I say depth, I mean below powerlifting depth. Just picture your classical ATG. So this person can do it. They can repeat it. It doesn't seem to aggravate anything. So that checks out. So that's cool. At the same time, for this person, they also have a very good low bar position. So they could do the low bar. So similar idea. And they could cut it shorter. They could, go to below parallel. They could go to parallel. And understandably so, it's not like one's form will always be the exact same. This is my squat. This is the only way I'm going to squat. But what then would be the major considerations in choosing your squat style if you're versatile? Because I do see that sometimes, and I will say this is very anecdotally, and it's more based on me specifically. But when I say like some bodybuilders, as an example, you'll be surprised. As an example, posing. Okay, that's what I was thinking of. Where you wanted me to try a side tricep one time and just even get my shoulder back there in that position, man, from just, I don't know, bench press, whatever. Anyways, I was tight. I think some people would be surprised if you're more focused on hypertrophy, how flexible you are, or more flexible maybe than the average gym bro that just sticks to a small subset of movements. I'm talking real bodybuilders that do posing, and thus they have to get used to being in uncomfortable positions. So if you have that possibility, Eric, so you have all tools, so to speak, at your disposal. Does it come down to personal preference? Is that a key factor? Like, which one do you prefer to do? And thus you can invest the most amount of mental energy, focus into quality repetitions. What would be the main factors there if you are that person that is gifted?
Yeah, I would say it is enjoyment and personal preference. I think you need to think about as a bodybuilder, what are the tools at your disposal to hypertrophy various muscle groups? So for example, where personal preference probably shouldn't come into play is too broad of an idea of what trains a given muscle group. So like if you're thinking, I hate leg extensions because they burn too much and I just don't like machines and I like free weights, so I'm only going to do just barbell squats, that should be fine. Well, we actually have a lot of data showing that barbell squats aren't great for hypertrophying your rectus femoris, because the rectus femoris is not only a knee extensor, but also a hip flexor. And hip flexion is not going to be very active when you're trying to do hip extension, because it's the antagonist to it. So when you're trying to stand up out of a squat, you have to shorten your glutes. So you can also shorten your rectus femoris, but it would produce an antagonizing force to it. So it would reduce your overall force production, be less efficient. And generally what we see is that biarticular muscles, like the hamstrings, which not only extend the hip, but also flex the knee, and the rectus femoris, which, like I said, not only extend the knee, but also flex the hip, they're relatively inactive and don't get very good hypertrophy stimulus from something like a squat. So squats are great for the vasti muscles, all the other heads of the quadricep, as well as your glutes. So if someone has kind of a muscle mag idea of what muscles are trained by which movements, like, leg extension, squats, both are quads, I'll choose whatever I want. That probably is not where I would say you want personal preference. You'd want them within those categories. So, okay, let's say I can do squats, I can do front squat, high bar, low bar, safety bar, Zercher, or leg press, or hack squats, or a split squat. I'd say, yeah, go wild. Do the one that you really enjoy the most, where you can get the largest range of motion and you're pain-free and the setup isn't annoying, things like that. However, if you're skipping something that would result in more symmetrical development, that's not something you'd want to do. So what am I going to, let's say I hate leg extensions. Well, I need to figure out something else which has predominantly just knee extension without concomitant hip extension. And there's other ways to do that. So you could do like a sissy squat. You could do like a heel elevated squat. The more basically that your back stays, relatively straight and there's less backward hip travel. I mean, there's still going to be some hip extension, don't get me wrong. But you can probably get a much more dominant kind of quadricep movement where you would probably get more rectus femoris involvement. You can do like reverse Nordics, as well, which is basically like going back as you're in a kneeling position and then using your quads to help you stand back up. You can use assisted versions. There's a lot of ways to do it. So I think generally, I guess this is almost like a caveat to what you were saying, or a disclaimer that yes, it should be based on personal preference when you have the ability to do multiple movements that train the same muscle group the same way. However, a lot of people don't have a great conception of what are things that train muscle groups the same way. Another example would be, I really like barbell compound movement, so I only do close grip bench press for triceps. Well, again, another biarticular muscle. The long head of the tricep performs shoulder extension as well as elbow extension. So when you're doing a bench press, which requires shoulder flexion, the long head's not getting a whole lot of training because it would be counteracting that. So you probably will need some isolated tricep work, not just in a compound movement. So this is something more like our power builders need to consider. Like they think, triceps, close grip bench press. Okay, cool. Quads, squats, good to go. And if they're actually considering like bodybuilding as a kind of a competitive or idyllic outcome of having proportionate development in all muscle groups, they're probably leaving a few things on the table.
Eric, fantastic. That was a very involved, well thought out answer. We got a softball question here. Do either of you care to comment on the recent USAPL IPF dispute? Just real simple things.
Nice.
Yeah. What I would say, we could sidestep that question. I do have a question for my bodybuilder now that we're talking about more hypertrophy-oriented questions. Not, once again, as a reaction to any other podcast asserting that, once again, bodybuilding is the true choice, the true sport of champions. But I know in natural bodybuilding, and I do know there are politics involved, so answer whichever way you feel comfortable, Eric. But I will say, so I'll speak very generally here, that I am a huge advocate of putting the barbell in as many hands as possible, having access, availability for people to participate, whatever that may be, competition or otherwise. So I do see some benefits in having a larger organizational structure so people can participate, and there's like a path forward, and it's like, you compete here, so you do regional, and then you go provincial, you move state, so on and so forth. So there's a structure to be understood, and there's readily agreed upon rules. My question, I guess, then for you, Eric, based off of nothing to do with that USAPL, IPF, but just in general for natural bodybuilding, what are some things you think, in your opinion, can be done that would lead to greater exposure or ease of participation? Any of the things that you've seen, because we both witnessed the explosion of powerlifting in the last decade, and there was, you would know this more than me, you know the memberships and everything, from maybe 2005 I'd say to 2013, I would guess natural bodybuilding, the amount of competitors went up. But as someone who's participated, as someone who enjoys it, as a spectator, enthusiast, all those sorts of things, what are some of those components now that we're seeing maybe a fracturing in another sport, in another dimension, that, again, answer whichever way you want, not to offend a particular party, but just maybe some things you'd want to see for greater exposure and ease of access?
Great question. So first, I will say to the question that was a softball that we're kind of sort of sidestepping, is I would endorse the King of the Lifts podcast. They did actually a really good job on 2 recent episodes, or actually even 3, before it happened, as it was happening, and then the most recent outcome of many of the USAPL national team switching to the U.S. Virgin Islands as their team so that they can go to Worlds. And the reason why I endorse it is because it's one of the more unbiased takes. So Ryan Lapidat, who runs it, he's from Canada, so and then also Aaron Kamisi, who's on there. He's worked in the USAPL for years. I met him coaching at Worlds when I went there, so he's from the States. And they've also got my good buddy Rory Lynch, who's from New Zealand, and he's part of the national coaching team there. So you can get a really good broader perspective of people who are following this closely, know the people involved, and have seen it go down, are not directly involved with the actual decisions, but definitely have their ear to the ground, but also don't have a biased position, as they're not the IPF and they're not the USAPL. And they're not heavily in favor of either one. And I think they're definitely, quote unquote, for the lifters, if you will. So anyway, just to shout out to them, I think they did a really good job in the last couple episodes. So if people want to get a rundown on that, my thoughts generally echo kind of the consensus of what was represented there. Now, the funny thing is that there's far more drama in natural bodybuilding, but nobody cares because, so for example, the USAPL, like decades ago, actually was a different federation. And then, it became part of the IPF, and now it looks like it's probably going to not be associated with the IPF long term. That happens all the time in bodybuilding, so often that we will actually forget which federations still exist. So right now, I still have confusion as to whether the OCB, the IPE, and the IFPA are different, organized together. Which one has a pro division, which one has an amateur division? And there was these huge fallouts, and I can't even remember necessarily who runs which anymore. So yeah, like of course there's far more drama if you've got actual whole federations splitting within themselves, being dissolved, figuring out who actually has rights to the show, having it go on, having everything change. But because the heads of natural bodybuilding organizations bicker so much, it's not even possible to follow it. So people just don't care. So what I think would solve the political issues in the political drama, I should say, in powerlifting, is you just need more of it. You need to get to the point where the bodybuilders, or in this case the powerlifters, just tune it out completely and just wait for you to figure out what the show date is, and then they'll just show up. And then you bitch about loyalty. Like then you can't understand why the natural bodybuilders, or the powerlifters in this case, would compete in whichever show is in their area. Like, why wouldn't you have loyalty to the organization that had two different names, two different owners, switched twice, changed its amateur affiliate, changed its rules, and then blasted on social media this organization, but is now a part of it, and then bought it and then lost it and came back. I don't understand why people don't have more loyalty. So that's basically what we've got in natural bodybuilding. But I will endorse who we've had on before, Bob Bell and Tina. They do a great job running the WNBF, one of the oldest ones that's been around the longest, and it's been pretty damn good and consistent for recent times. And it is probably the highest quality natural bodybuilding organization we've got currently. That's not shade at any other organization. It's just if you pop your head up for a year and then you don't pay attention for another year, it's going to be a very different scene in bodybuilding. So I'm just kind of going with the one that hasn't changed that much over the years. Not that it hasn't. So anyway, how do we make natural bodybuilding better? I think there's actually a lot to learn from some of the things that powerlifting and especially the USAPL has done. Not the recent drama. I feel like that's the USAPL learning from natural bodybuilding. But instead, I think what powerlifting could potentially teach natural bodybuilding organizations is just better and more consistent live streaming. I would actually also like to see more transparency in the judging, so you can actually see like what the judges put up and which judges at different times. Like right now in powerlifting, you've got 3 judges on the platform. You know whether they gave a white light or a red light, and you also know when they hold up cards as what the likely reason was. And that is information you can find out right then and there. A lot of the times bodybuilding organizations are a lot more opaque. You know what the final placings were, but you don't necessarily know what the scorecards were unless you ask for it. And I think not only should the scorecards just be posted up all the time, but it would be great if they were actually shown live as soon as each judge finished theirs. I think that would also remove, I don't think there's actually nearly as much politics in the judging of shows that people think they are, because bodybuilding is just too small. But I think it would remove a lot of the perception of that if it was there. And it would probably make judges do a better job if they knew that everyone was going to see their scorecard every time. And I think that's probably one of the reasons that doesn't happen. It's just that judges don't want to deal with that, which is understandable. But maybe that should be changed. I think it should. Another thing I'd put forth is, we have openpowerlifting.org, which is fantastic. And even before that, you could very easily, you can go to like the IPF or the USAPL website, and you can look up a database of all the lifters, all their history, their lifts, and the outcomes of every different meet. It is really difficult to find the outcomes of shows comparatively in a relative sense. They're not all posted online. They're not posted in any timely way, and they're not central in a central database of any type. So it is very difficult to go, hey, I'd like to see if you want to know all of Brian Whitaker's placings and everything he's done, you have to go to his website. Like, he's done that for himself. And so I think it's very difficult to be a fan of natural bodybuilding unless you're really, really already deeply entrenched in it. Like, I know where to find these things, but it's a mixture of old Facebook pages, Instagram posts, outdated websites, personal websites, things like that. Well, yeah, I mean, if they're really doing it right. So generally, I just think there needs to be better organization, but that's tough to do because each one of the organizations is very mom and pop. They tend to be centrally controlled. So the person is not only trying to run the actual administration of the organization and run the shows, But they typically don't have people to help them do that. So, and because they're all fractured and not working together, they have less, person power and resources to do that. So yeah, generally like, less ego, more working together, more transparency, and better organization. The actual how to do all that when you have the type of personalities that are often involved in bodybuilding is difficult though.
When you got all that spray tan and spandex involved, I mean, the drama ensues. And Eric, I will just say from our intro, I should clarify something. That yes, while I was definitely there during your win at the Royal River City Rumble 2019 Classic, what you probably don't remember due to the trauma, much like the 2011, I was there at your show 2019 Muscle Mania, and it was there that I made my heroic final stand in defense of you, where I grabbed the trophy and I exclaimed, "Eric should have won," and I said, "Also, he looks better than your god, Frank Zane." And that's when you collapsed into the fetal position saying, "Oh God, what have you done?" They rushed me with their spray tan and spandex, and I had my last stand holding the biceps, trying to defend you and shield you from the haters. And that's what happened. And I did yell. So to be clear to the bodybuilders too, I did yell, "Come at me, bro," which was a challenge. They took it differently.
Yeah, you got so many things wrong there. I don't even know where to begin. So first, I think you called the Muscle Mayhem, which you were not at, Muscle Mania.
It's like WrestleMania,
which is actually, well, Muscle Mania is actually another federation, which I don't expect everyone to know all the federations. Yeah, no, you randomly just named a federation. That's how many there are. So none of that ever happened, and you didn't even name the show right. But besides that, I don't think you got anything wrong.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, like I said, trauma is tough, and your ability to recall true events is obviously clouded. I was there,
right,
and that's when I solidified, because sometimes it is through going under those shared experiences, like wartime pals, that you really foster those deep connections, and that's when I knew I had to look after my number one. So that's what happened. And I could say that besides that, I think there's a lot going on. I do wish the ranking system that you outlined, I think that's fantastic. Simply because I would be curious, right? You wanted to like, oh, this is like my favorite bodybuilder. Like, how did this natural bodybuilder do against this other person? Oh, they competed together. Well, what? Well, this person, and then what? Like, I'm making this up, but like Jim scored them 43 points or what? Like, you could just have open access to scoring and then to placing would allow people to create rankings, hierarchies, and just participate like any other sport, like open powerlifting, you said, I think would be massive. And hopefully there is always, all sports, I think, are predicated at first on the genuine enthusiasm and passion of a select few individuals. I do think there would be someone willing to do that, to like collect the data. this is like a high pay, like, hey, you're going to be the bodybuilding chronicle. I'm like, this is for free. There'll be no accolades, right? But I think it'd get done. So I think that was those were fantastic points, man.
Yeah. Last thing I will say is that I've always been a little disappointed that all of the media coverage of bodybuilding is always done by fans with very little help or involvement from the actual organizations themselves. So like if a bodybuilder is going to get any kind, like it's not like there's regular interviews after, like you'll see some powerlifting meets where the MC will interview the winner after each one, or like if you watch the Arnold, after a certain event, they'll be like, "Hey Brian Shaw, hey Big Z, how did that go? Did you prepare for that? Awesome, thanks for being here," kind of thing.
Yep.
That's extremely rare in bodybuilding. And there were times we actually got discouraged from doing things like that early on with 3D Muscle Journey. Just to kind of show this very kind of, not everyone, but there's a lot of people in the natural bodybuilding world, because it's such a crowded space, where they almost act like crabs in a barrel, where they're trying to, grasp for the little tiny piece of territory they have, which kind of just removes the quality from everything. So I think, in general, we just need more people involved in natural bodybuilding who have a very kind of, open-minded, a tide rises all ships type of mentality, rather than trying to point out how their organization might be better than others, or how other people aren't doing it right, or how they're doing it the best. I don't think that really helps anything.
And that's why I differ from you, because clearly I support the Muscle Mania organization, which is the number one organization for, natural bodybuilding.
That you learned about today. Yes.
Yeah, hey, that I remembered. I recalled. I randomly recalled. Eric, we've spoken, a bunch about that there, bodybuilders. Let's take a question now as it relates to powerlifting and getting stronger. And someone essentially wants to know, why is it? It seems like they're gaining weight and they're gaining mostly fat mass. They're not a beginner. They're more towards an intermediate lifter, it seems like, and they're still getting stronger. So you spoke about all the things being equal. If you have more muscle mass, it would be more preferential towards getting stronger. But I've noticed this even myself. I'll just say anecdotally that on the bench press, that if I gain just a few pounds and it's not solid mass, right? Let's just say I go on a short-term bulk, it's favorable. Like it's almost a 2-to-1 ratio. I could gain 5 pounds of body weight and my bench press will go up 10 pounds. And we definitely know that it's not muscle mass, or a large portion isn't. So I guess the kernel of this person's question is that why is it sometimes gaining overall weight? Because there is the emphasis, I think, placed especially on in the natural community towards gaining quality weight. So an emphasis on muscle mass. But it seems like for a lot of people that their Wilk, so any coefficient that you want to evaluate, will continue to rise as they get just larger overall. So what are some of those considerations then?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one I've thought about a lot over time. And there's not a firm answer on that. So one thing to consider is that it's very difficult to tell if you're gaining 100% fat or 70% fat, 30% muscle,
or 98% fat,
and 2% muscle. Yeah, like if you're gaining predominantly fat, you mostly just see fat gain.
Right.
And I think it's very difficult to know whether you're actually putting on muscle tissue. So that's one minor disclaimer. Another thing to consider is that you can actually be losing muscle mass in the short term and actually gaining strength. That's just like a taper. We've even observed that. There was one I think I've talked about it before. There's a case series on 2 weightlifters at a Dr. Stone's lab where they followed their plan and got them ready for competition. And their jump height that they had measured right before the competition peaked at the same time as their muscle size was actually starting to drop a little bit. So there's a lot of things and factors that go into strength. And the tapering process is one where you're dropping volume to reduce fatigue to enhance performance acutely. However, we also know that volume is a major player in inducing hypertrophy. So you kind of can't have both all the time at the same time, especially when tapering. So it's not uncommon for the tail end of a periodization plan where volume's going down, intensity is going up, and you're trying to dump as much fatigue as possible to maybe even lose a little bit of size, but be stronger. So that's something to consider. They're not necessarily perfectly coupled. You really have to think of a long-term lens of the relationship between strength and size to understand how muscle size benefits you. That's why you don't always taper, right? Because then you're just peaking this strength that's not increasing over time. You're always ready to perform, but not actually training, So you're lowering your ceiling, but always being right at it, which you don't want. So any intelligent strength athlete is going to be doing hypertrophy work for long-term gains in strength. But short-term peaks, that really has to do more with just fatigue and fitness dynamics, right? So anyway, there's that. Now to get to your question of why does just gaining weight seem to help? It does on some lifts, but not others. So for example, the best deadlifts that have been pulled are typically in the 93, 105, or 120 class. And right there is where it starts to plateau and you see much less clear increases. While if you look at bench press and squat, they follow a pretty linear pattern as you go up the weight classes. Who's put up the biggest squat of all time? Ray Williams, right? Julius Maddox, he's trying to bench 800 pounds. These are big boys, But some of the best deadlifts have been pulled, like I said, in the 105 class. If you look at the IPF, you're right, that kind of peaks right around 400 kilos. And that has been pulled at non-super heavyweight divisions. And in fact, the supers sometimes struggle with deadlift because they have to get around their body. And sometimes their overall bulk and primarily body fat prevents them from getting in a good bottom position on the deadlift. Now, if you contrast that with, say, a bench press, where if you gain body fat, you're probably going to be gaining some body fat on your chest, and you're going to be definitely gaining some on your butt. So your ability to arch and keep your butt on the bench is aided by having butt fat, So I have had more instances where I lose contact with the bench with my powerlifting technique with my butt when I'm lean than when I have more poking out to touch it, right? And then while I think it's minor, you know, if you think about like skin fold measurements, like when you get like a pec skin fold measurement, when I'm in stage condition, it's a low single digit number. But in the off season, it might be 10 millimeters more than that. So that's not nothing. Like that's a centimeter change in range of motion. And it's also that centimeter change in range of motion at the bottom part of the bench where it's actually the hardest.
Yeah.
So I do think that very small changes in range of motion. So like when you're fat, it's 1 centimeter or less, range of motion that you have to press it, and you're starting in a more declined position. I think that makes a difference. In addition to the fact that you probably didn't gain pure fat, you probably did put on some lean mass in that process of moving up, say, 5-10 pounds.
That their gallon of milk a day. I have heard from the heavy boys, and I've actually witnessed this firsthand. Someone gained, we're talking entering the super heavy, so 308 plus back in the day, the untested federations, and how some of those people would report, as an example, on the squat, like their power belly is why they refer to it, that when they're in the hole, like the gut rubbing up against the thighs as they create a little bit of friction as they go down into lower depth, and it feels easier, their words, to push off. Or the same idea, they'll use it in a few different circumstances, but the deadlift to get into that proper position or more efficient position just becomes harder. And so you'll see that where like they're almost like some of the guys that pulled sumo, we're talking now, this is not the IPF outside, but their bellies are in the way of things. And even when they try and lock out, because it's kind of hanging out underneath there, so they want to lock out, and sometimes it looks like a soft lockout. The things we do for strength, Eric.
Yep. And I do want to harken back to when we had Bruce Crabshack on with, I think, Natalie Hansen and Mike Tushir, where they talked about how when you're actually wearing gear, like so single ply equipment, that having more fat mass can help you get more elastic rebound. Yeah. So it does depend on the perspective of the person asking the question. Like if they're looking at, single ply or multi-ply powerlifting, they might have a more favorable view of just general gain and mass compared to, say, raw lifting. I don't have any stats to back that up, just to put that out there, but the anecdotal experiences of people who've lifted both raw and equipped, which we had in that episode, I'd encourage you to check it out, is that, if I just get bigger, squat suits and bench press shirts seem to help me more, regardless of the quality of that weight gain.
Yeah, I forget what Bryce said exactly, but I do remember the word being thrown around, squishy, or like the squishier you are. When you put it on, like it just feels better. Yeah. Have you ever worn a bench shirt or anything like that?
I
never
have not.
Yeah.
I have yet to cross that iron bridge, but one day maybe.
one day maybe. This person wants to know, Eric, what have we changed recently when it comes to our positions on anything training or so exercise related or dietary? I do want to start very quickly and say, because that's something that's been one of the tonics of 2021, Eric, and that is the question of the utility when it comes to volume of compound movements if your goal is to try and increase that actual lift. So we spoke about that before as it relates to squats, that you don't have to do all your squat volume or all your leg volume or a large portion of it from the lift you're trying to improve, that you can get that skill acquisition from doing the singles, the frequency, and a variety of different things, and still having a high enough dose to affect that change to get stronger. And then if you want to build muscle, if you want to have hypertrophy, if you want to get more of that volume, something like a belt squat or anything else that'd be comparable, you can do that and have sort of the best of both worlds. Because I was running into that situation where I was getting grizzled with my body over time, trying to do the classic power building circa 2013 would probably be for me the biggest one to lead out the game.
I'm right there with you. I think that's something, I basically just kind of went through that process a little earlier than you, and probably only because I had to deal with the hip surgery.
Yep.
And I think that's one thing we kind of bonded over was my suggestion of that for you to try it out, and then you having some success with it. But yeah, I would say in addition to that, the data on frequency, which we talked about in, I guess it was our episode where we said we were wrong. If you go back to listen to that one, you can get a lot more depth on this. But the data on frequency, while it's always been relatively a minor player, like in my pyramid, I do include it with volume intensity on the same level of the pyramid, kind of the same way I include carbohydrates and fat with protein. Just because if you change, like if you're working with a fixed caloric amount and you manipulate one macronutrient, you have to manipulate another, right? That's just math. Same thing is true. Like if you are manipulating volume and intensity with no respect to frequency, you can run into trouble. So I always feel like they have to be kind of paired. So anyway, the frequency data, it went from interesting speculative stuff showing higher frequency might be beneficial to higher frequency is beneficial independent of volume, to now coming back to no, it probably seems like frequency is just a useful tool to accumulate volume because there is such a thing as doing too much volume in any given session. So yeah, it's not a huge shift in my position, but it's something I've been closely paying attention to and trying to align my guidelines to. And it's also something that I think the reason why we get these camps of people who are very different is because there is data to suggest that within individuals, it can make a big difference, even though it doesn't matter for the mean level. So you might respond very well to lower or higher frequency, even with the same amount of volume, which is, I think, pretty interesting. And it probably has to do with like the time course of recovery, how much muscle damage you get, what movement we're talking about. Going back to like that leg extension versus squat thing, when you're in a deep position of a squat, you're training your quads and your glutes in a long muscle length. The peak tension in a leg extension, it's kind of consistent depending on how the machine's built. Might be at the top, but you're never getting the same level of quad stretch on a leg extension. Like if you just look at someone and sitting with a leg extension in the bottom position, they're kind of like a half squat, So anyway, certain movements are not going to just induce nearly the same level of muscle damage. So you could probably train them more frequently. So it really depends on how you train and just your individual physiological factors. So anyway, that's one. I would say that that's a big one on how I've changed my position. And then also just the utility of singles. My old programming style was generally like, let's do things the right way to build strength and or muscle mass, and then we'll test to see if you got stronger. But I think now having submaximal singles that are not so submaximal that I'm not confident they don't represent your strength regularly in training for people who are interested in getting stronger is something that I was probably opposed to before. Like I was like, oh, that's too stressful, or you're going too heavy too frequently. And I maybe was strawmanning it a little too much as basically being like a Bulgarian method. But there's a big difference between going to a 10 RPE every time you train or 9.5 RPE every time you train and going to a 6 to 8 RPE twice a week, So I think a big change in my perspective is just finding that middle ground and benefiting from just having constant awareness of where someone's strength is and seeing if it lines up with what I'm attempting to accomplish.
No,
but that's it on the training front, I would say. And that's the question, was just the training stuff, yeah?
It's training nutrition, but Eric, I'm going to follow up with a question for you as it relates to having singles at a lower RP, because I remember this is from months back, and I didn't end up answering the person, and I do have some thoughts on it, but you're on a hot streak right now. I want to hear from you, man. With the utility of singles at lower RPs, because I think basically, if I remember, I'm paraphrasing here what the person said, is why would you do singles less than like a RP7 or RP8 when it's not close enough, the proximity of failure, it's not challenging enough, it's not going to provide a stimulus in order for an adaptation to occur where it's like, oh, you're actually working up to something that's going to challenge you. These are his words. So why would you even do it? Like, why would you do, if you're doing singles, Eric, 3 times a week, single at 6? Like, what is the utility there? Can you just address that, and then we could go to the nutrition?
Yeah, this is one of those questions where the person has an embedded belief in it.
That needs to be challenged.
Exactly. Like I dispute the claim that a single at a 6 RPE doesn't actually stimulate strength. And I think it's easily disputed if we get outside of the world of RPE. Like if we were in 2010 and I wrote, I want you to do 3 singles at 87% of 1RM. They'd be like, okay, cool. So this is a pretty heavy practice day, like this isn't too far off for like Prilipin's chart or whatever. Like, that's a strength day. Maybe it's a recovery strength day, or it's a kind of quote unquote, like it fits into the DUP structure as the P day, right? And while in the DUP structure where you have, hypertrophy, power, then strength, the advantage of that is not like the reason why it's not just hypertrophy day off strength is because there's thought to be some utility, of course, not as much as doing like heavier and more volume, of those singles of that heavy practice kind of power day. And it's better than not doing anything, right? It's essentially heavy practice. And it is a useful way of getting in volume that doesn't induce enough fatigue to get in the way of that day where you are doing volume and load. And I think another way to look at it is let's even be more charitable and say the assumption has some merit. Because I do think like if you were to only have most of your heavy training, like let's say you're doing just a bodybuilding training program with very little squats and bench or deadlifts in there, and you were just doing one single a week, and let's say a 5 or 6 RPE on the squat, bench, and deadlift, I think that if you did that with a powerlifter, like you just took a powerlifter who went through an intensity block, let's say they can squat 500, bench 300, and deadlift 600, just to make the math very easy. Let's say that's where their strength is. And you go, right, I'm going to put you on the hammer strength program, and you are only going to squat to a 5 or a 6 RPE on bench, squat, and deadlift once per week. I think they would probably lose strength, but I think they would lose that strength far slower than you'd expect doing a single at like a 6 RPE once per week on those lifts compared to just doing the hammer strength program, right? So the question is not, so in some cases, first, I do challenge the idea that singles at a 6 RPE don't stimulate strength. I think they do. I think you'll see very high force production because when you're moving a load at a 6 RPE, it's not fast, but it's not slow either, Like you can't move 87% of 1RM, which would probably be roughly a single at a 6 RPE. At the same speed, you can move 40% of 1RM, which you could jump with, right? You can't, ain't nobody jumping with 87% of their 1RM. You're not going to leave the ground. So that means that you are actually producing near max force. Now, it's still a different movement, don't get me wrong, because you're not learning to grind from doing a 6 RPE, but you're still getting very high levels of force production. And the research on velocity loss thresholds would suggest that having a 10 or 20% velocity loss in a set. So let's say we take two groups. One group is training at 75% or 80% of 1RM, so is the other group. But one group does reps in a set until they lose just 10% of their velocity. So let's say their first rep is at 0.4 meters per second. When they hit 0.36 meters per second, they stop. So they might only be like 2 reps at 75%. When you compare that to a 40% velocity loss, where they start at 0.4, and now they actually have to get down to like 0.24, that is near failure. So they're going to like a 9.5 RPE on average. The group that does the 10 to 20% velocity loss tends to get stronger. So I think that's probably just related to acute fatigue. I think if you took it long enough, it wouldn't be the same way. So the idea here is part of that could be that as you're taking a fixed load and you can't move it as quickly due to fatigue, you're producing less force. That's why the barbell hits failure, because you can't produce enough force to keep it moving. So you're emphasizing the reps in a set that has the highest force production. Again, there's a trade-off though, because you're also not training close to failure, which is what a 1RM is. Like a 10 RPE, you couldn't have done another 2.5 kilos. You couldn't have done another rep. You have to be good at grinding. So you're losing some specificity for increasing force production. And I would say that trade-off is probably worth it when you're far away from actually needing to express a 1RM. And this is, if you guys want to get the skinny on this, definitely check out our episode with Zach from Data Driven Strength. We talk a lot more about this in depth. But the overall take-home message is, 1, 5, 6, and 7 RPE training does have its place, but it does have its drawbacks. And at the very least, it can be used to slow down a decay in strength if you're training very non-specific for whatever reason. And the very best case scenario, if it has sufficient frequency and a sufficient volume, it can be used as part of a strategy while minimizing fatigue to enhance strength. Wouldn't be the only one. I typically, if I'm periodizing it, someone will go through a phase of doing singles at a 5 to 7 RPE and doing more volume and more accessory work. Then they'll go through a mesocycle of doing singles at a 6 to 8 RPE and doing less volume and less accessory work, and more of that volume coming from the main lifts as back offsets. And then as we get closer to competition, we go to a 7 to 9 RPE. That same pattern follows. And then finally, we're doing singles at an 8 to 10 RPE, tapering and competing. So it becomes increasingly more specific. So the right question is not, why don't you just do all of it at an 8 or all of it at 5? Doesn't that not make any sense? But how do you use these different approaches and their pros and cons synergistically in an overall plan to increase strength long-term and consistently?
Eric, that was fantastic. And I will say to the person asking that question, this actually was now several months ago. I remember this because similar, echoing what you said before, where your plan, you transition back to powerlifting and what you were going to do and what you're incorporating. And then based on our conversations, when I was rebooting myself for my strength program, and I posted, I think, one of the lighter singles, once again, just reacquainting myself with singles. And I posted that. The tone was interesting because, as you said, there's built within it an assumption to that question. But there also was an implication I found interesting in that there not only isn't really any utility, but also that proverbial you're not training hard enough. You know what I mean? Like you used to lift this amount of weight, and then now you're lifting that. Because I remember a few comments by this, on this journey. But that was, once again, it's like a little synonymous with that, where it's like, oh, like lower RP, it's easy. Why aren't you pushing yourself, right? As opposed to framing. It's so funny how you could frame a question. I really think that if I posted, now that you mention it, Eric, 87.5% times one, a single at 87.5% wouldn't have batted an eye, right? Would have just been like, oh yeah, okay. I mean that sounds heavy. Then you say it's 6, it's like at 6? At 6 out of 10? What? 6 out of 10? That's in school, that's a terrible grade.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I noticed, so I post on my stories a lot of my workouts, and I used to post, like, just when I was more in a powerlifting phase, I wouldn't post the accessory work, right? And I would just post the singles. And when I was in an early block where I was doing a lot of accessory work and just posting singles, it made the workout look really easy. Even though I posted, like, here's what I did. People don't want to read all that. It's Instagram. They just want to see the videos. So they go, oh, Eric's posting a workout. Smoked that single. Oh, next story, he's done. Or he did a bench, he's done. And I get these little comments like, I don't understand, like what, and now I post it, like, for example, the current block I'm doing, I have 2 singles on bench per week, 1 single on squat, 1 single on deadlift. And they're at a low RPE. Like, for example, I just squatted 227 or 501 4 weeks ago. And I have done singles at 190, 192, and 195. So which is like 418, 424, and 429. So those are, like 80 pounds to 90 pounds less than, or 75 pounds less than what I did. So that's a solid, like similar kind of percentage we're talking about. Singles at a 5 to 7 RPE, right? But I don't get those comments now because then they see me do, like RDL, leg extension, split squats, homemade hack squats, leg curls, and calf raises afterwards. So that I think it's a little more clear that, oh, he's like, just keeping his skill of lifting up. And it's a little more like a practical application of it. But yeah, when I wasn't posting all the accessory work, when I was in a powerlifting phase, 'cause I was like, whatever, no one wants to see this because I'm in the same headset of being a powerlifter.
Yep.
It created more questions.
These fools, Eric. That raises a good question, and I will once again, based off of this question, I'm going to rephrase it a little bit, and that is, as it relates to accessories, what is the utility or what is the importance then of doing accessory movements in the modern context where specificity is kind of paramount? So the idea, let's say hypothetically, Eric, pick one of the big 3, squat, bench, deadlift, or any of them, where it's like, oh, you wanted to get better at squatting, you got to squat more. Okay, granted, right? So we're going to do 3 times a week, 2 times a week, 4 times, figure out your frequency. You're going to incorporate singles. You're going to, waive the intensity, proximity failure, yada, 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 all that good stuff. That's like the bulk of what's going to help you make progress. But then what is, within the modern context, our understanding of strength and programming, the utility of accessory movements? So maybe on the bench press, like it's like, yeah, your coach programs for you some tricep extensions, or you have something that is not a variation of one of the main movements. So you might program in for someone, Eric, like a dip or anything else. And I understand there'll also be different phases of one's training. So the closer, of course, it's a given as one's training closer to competition, it's more specific, less general. But if we're to talk accessories that aren't variations of main movements, what would be some of the potential utility within those?
Well, that's a great free frame, because I think for anyone who is savvy and has been listening for the last 40 minutes that we've been talking, they will be able to answer this question on their own for at least movements that are variations. Like, like he said, if you got a big arch and a wide grip bench, that's not a great way to grow your pecs, even though that'll allow you to bench the most you can right now. So I should probably do feet up bench.
Yep.
But I like the way you're going, then why would I ever do tricep extensions?
Yeah.
Or why would I ever do, a pec fly or something like that? And the answer is that generally, because you're focusing so much on specificity and because you're doing so much volume and giving so much attention to these main movements, that they tend to also be the thing that's going to generate some pain. They also might generate, they tend to generate more fatigue as well. They're compound movements. They take a lot out of you. So the question becomes like it's like, think about it this way. Like if you're doing some split squats, you're like, well, why wouldn't you just do another 5 set of squats? because it's 5 sets of squats, bro. You know, so I think you have to think about the return on investment. There's probably only so much squatting you can do in a given session before it becomes counterproductive. Before it just means that your hips are going to feel like trash on your deadlift day next time. However, if that occurs before the point when you've gotten all the stimulus for hypertrophy that you would like, then it would probably serve you to try to find another movement to achieve that. So the answer to the question is essentially that most people, either psychologically or physiologically, in terms of their joint integrity or just their time investment, because it takes a lot of time to also do 5x5 on squats, the rest periods are longer, would get a better return on investment for the energy psychologically, the stress on their body physiologically, and the time it takes to actually set it up by doing something more simple. So, if you finished, 5 sets on squats and you're mentally fatigued, your hips are sore, you're beat up, but you only got a total of 15 working reps, and you're thinking, well, I'm in an off-season phase, or let's say I'm farther from competition. The goal of this phase is to produce more hypertrophy. What makes more sense? To drop another 10 kilos off the bar and do another 3 sets of 6 on squats, or to go over to the dumbbell rack, put your straps on, grab 30, and then put your back foot on a bench and do some split squats? Obviously the latter, right? So I think, maybe in certain cases where someone is like super well built to squat, very resilient to injury, and does not find it very mentally taxing, has great cardiovascular recovery between sets, and doesn't have that person at the gym who always talks to them and slows down their workout, sure, you could have a much more, you could have a much more specific workout. But for many people, it makes a lot more sense to get the accessory movements in, because they are lower stress, easier ways, and lower stress in every sense of the word, in terms of both mentally and physically, and they're less time demanding ways of getting in volume. And I would question anyone who thinks that a set of 8 on squats is really that specific. It's so far away from a 1RM. The hypertrophy that it produces is going to be a little more regionally specific to what you need on a squat, but not that much more compared to a split squat. So this is something I've talked a lot about as well. Like, this is sort of a tangent to what you're asking, because if I took your question in good faith that you were well informed, then you'd be going, well, I wouldn't be doing 8s at all if specificity is king. I'd rather do, instead of 3 sets of 8, I would do 8 sets of 3. Or something like that to keep the specificity. But I think a lot of people, what they do is they think of movement specificity primarily. They put their belt on, they get their same walkout, they're wearing their singlet, and they do a set of 8. And that's not specific, just period, because it's a load you can do 8 reps with. So I think that is closer to doing, 8 reps on leg press than it is to doing a 1RM. So why not do the one that is non-specific and maybe less stressful and takes less time? You can actually lay back while you're doing it, and focus more on just your legs getting a stimulus, rather than, fatiguing your lower back even more and then actually impeding your next leg day.
Eric, I'm going to close out with this. I think it's a testament to your coaching and, being across a wide variety of disciplines, that you take into account the ghost in the machine, the proverbial ghost in the machine, and that how a human actually will operate. And I think that is very important, because sometimes I will see recommendations online, and we've spoke about this before, where you can see someone that never was a personal trainer, where there's that separation. If you're an online coach, you program for someone, and you just assume there's like givens that you put into the programming. Like, oh, they'll do it, to your point, like, oh, power, like the single, this, that, and they'll do back off sets of 8. And they're not thinking about the enjoyment of that person, their structural integrity. Like, of course, they could do that. Like, they're young, they're capable. Why not? You just got to muscle through, like, do this, so on and so forth. That there's all these considerations underneath that iceberg, right? The tip of the iceberg is visible, like what one must do, but it's like, how does this fit in this person's personality? How then focused will they be on the quality of the movements? You think that if someone has programmed maybe 8 sets of squats, so a mixture of like a single plus something more specific, so triples, but then they're doing their volume work for hypertrophy and they're doing sets of 12, that they're not going to start dreading that workout. That if you can accomplish, basically, if we can agree broadly that, once again, sets of 12 aren't really specific towards strength. So you're doing that movement now both for strength when you do your sets of 3, but then more towards hypertrophy when you do your sets of 12. If we could broadly agree also that if you were to have the similar proximity failure and do another accessory movement, Bulgarian split squats, doesn't matter, let's another one, but their overall enjoyment would be higher, or they won't be dreading that workout. Because I've been there, just like what you described, where you said that like I had that pang I felt in my stomach where I would program something for myself and then back off sets. And whether you're aware of it or not, even the people that say, man, I love training, when you get in there, you kind of start spacing out your energy, because we all, whether we admit it or not, have a finite amount of energy to give in a workout. And we can up the caffeine dose, put on the music, get excited. But when you want to manage overall fatigue, so not only the real fatigue, like the physical fatigue necessary to recover from, also the mental, like your preparation getting into training and so forth, it's like I do feel one of the roles of a qualified coach, and it sounds always counterintuitive, because people always hate, just like the RP6, the concept of something being easy, is you want to provide the path of least resistance. So accomplish the highest goal the easiest possible way, the way that has the highest likelihood of success, I think should be one of the functions. And so sometimes we have that attachment towards hardcoreness or like, or tradition or any of these things. And it's outside of the true consideration, which is the lifter. So I do notice that, man. And obviously a lot of your questions, but just the experience, of course, yeah, man, you being a researcher, your academic distinctions, like, cool, that's whatever. That is a strong component of it. But also then the human component of it, I think, provides the tangible, practical takeaway pieces of advice. You know what I mean?
Oh, I thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. And yeah, and I think there's other ways to consider this too. It depends on like some people will argue for a high volume of specificity for different reasons. You know, I kind of addressed the argument of the specific hypertrophy in the same regions that would be used in a squat, and I think I did a pretty good job of that. That it doesn't all have to come from, like there's easier variations which provide simultaneous hip and knee extension, that don't provide the same stress. Another argument is that you're trying to get your quote unquote 10,000 hours. You need all the deliberate practice you can to get better at it. So a high volume training program is better. And I think what you just implicitly discussed there is that at a certain point when you're doing really high volume specific training, you're just going through the motions. It stops being deliberate practice. You're just getting through it. On your fifth set of 4 with 75% of 1RM, you're just like, let's get it done, And I think if the goal, like there's no time I've ever gotten on a platform and actually did my 1RMs first, second, or third attempt, and I was like, let's just get this done. I wasn't paying attention. Like I'm locked in, I'm zoned in. I don't hear anything except for the squat commands, right? You're highly intentional in that moment. So if you're actually trying to get deliberate practice, that needs to be specific too. You need to be deliberately aware of how each rep is performed, whether you were performing it to the technical standards that you're trying, and was my practice for the skill I'm trying to develop successful, right? And if you're just going through the motions to complete volume and tick off all the boxes, that's not occurring. Now, if you want to do that for hypertrophy, that's fine, because it doesn't, like, putting tension on a muscle, like we stand around on the planet Earth and we have a certain level of muscle mass without being intentional in our day-to-day lives. And if we leave the gravity well, and if we become astronauts, we lose muscle without being intentional, right? So I think if you're just trying to put meat on your bones, then yeah, you can go through the motions and just lift, so long as you're still executing relatively well. But if your argument, I should say, is to get all that time spent in deliberate practice, well, you better make sure the practice is actually deliberate. And I think that's going to be very individual to how much can you do and stay tuned in. And this is actually something that I think a lot of Olympic lifters get wrong, in my opinion. They just do so much volume and train multiple times. They just think they really need to drill a skill set and hammer it. But I think, man, unless I'm just a weak-willed Olympic lifter, even me with so much to work on, I find there's a finite amount of intention and focus I can put into developing a skill. And that's a higher level of skill than something like a squat, and yet they're doing even more. So I think that's something to consider, is that when you're coaching people to develop skills, you need to think about what is the most amount they can do before it actually becomes counterproductive or just not productive. Actually, I think video gamers will get this. There is that point where you need to just put the controller away. Especially like in old school games. Like when I play, yes. like if my wife and I are playing Mario and you miss the same jump like 15 times, you need to stop, because you're just getting more and more mad, and you're not actually getting any better.
Man, Eric, so I love that because that actually reminded me when you play some of those twitchy games. I'm playing right now for the PlayStation a shoot 'em up called Einhander, made by Squaresoft, and I'll do a run. I'll play it late at night to unwind, and sometimes it goes like you made it to stage 6, you made it to stage 7, you made it to, and then you play it again, and it's like you made it to stage 4, and there's that clear regression where your skills are just diminishing over time, and you're like, all right, you got to put that away, right?
Yes.
One thing I was going to say, this is, I do think for a few reasons it's a poor analogy, but it was helpful for me to conceptualize it when we're talking about the 10,000 hours or that argument of, quality work or doing higher repetitions. It's a little bit analogous to me training a sprinter that wants to become faster at sprinting, which is predominantly power, that speed component, short duration, and said, well, yeah, like you need more practice. So you're going to do your sprinting, your 60 meter, 100, and then you're also going to do practice with the 400 meter. It's like at 200 meters, there's a lot of carryover. 400 meters, so higher repetitions, there's a certain threshold where it starts shifting. And sure, if someone's, let's say, very overweight, poorly trained, them just getting more overall conditioning, and as a byproduct, them losing weight via doing more activity will lead to being a lighter body weight, and that will transfer in some way to their sprint practice. And someone make that, well, they're both running, like you're getting more practice by doing the 400 meter. It's like, but that doesn't have really a carryover to your 100 meter time whatsoever. And that's where
No, you're
specificity becomes
intentionally
important.
slowing yourself down
Yeah.
in the first half of a 400 meter.
Yeah.
And then during the 300, you're trying to keep pace. So you're putting out more effort, but you're getting the same output. And in the last 100 meters of a 400 meter, you're just trying to survive and get across the finish line. And you're actively slowing down in many cases.
Yeah.
So with the 100 meter, it is like go as hard as possible the entire time.
Yep.
So I think it is very different, for sure. And yeah, I remember back in high school, and I think we had a relatively good track coach looking back in terms of his technical skill. Very good coach as well, just like in terms of a human being speaking to other human beings. And the 100 meter guys didn't do the same stuff as us 400 meter guys. The 200 meter people, yes, some carryover,
Right.
but it would depend on which one they focused on and what was coming up. So I think it's a pretty good analogy. And there's a classic saying in S&C that practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanent. And I think that helps you understand that you probably don't want to be going through the motions, in general, if you're trying to develop a skill, because you're more likely to make technical errors, right? Especially at like the low loads that you can do for multiple sets, I will say this is something that I haven't seen in strength sport very much, occasionally in weightlifting, that I think would be really interesting. And I would love to see someone maybe investigate this either anecdotally, just with their coaching clients, or potentially even actually doing a study where you have an open-ended practice day. So like you take your typical DUP setup, and then the number of sets you do on your power day, your heavy practice day, is you do singles or doubles or triples at somewhere between 75 to 85% of 1RM. Probably not triples at 85%, because that's actually just pretty darn heavy. But like, inverse. So if it's 85% singles, if it's 75% triples or doubles or whatever, and you do as many as you can, where you feel like you're engaged. So you have the participant rate, like, here's I feel intentional. I was aware, and I felt like these were high quality repetitions. I felt this practice out of 5 was at least a 4 or a 5. But then once you start recording reps that are 3 out of 5 or lower, then you just stop. Like once you hit 2, 3 out of 5 quality or lower, or whatever metrics you want to use. I'm sure there's some motor learning specialists who have a much better idea than me just throwing a random Likert scale at it. Or they could even objectively, assess like joint positions. I could use the 3D cameras or 2D camera or something like that. I think it would be a really interesting study to where the groups were matched for what they did on the strength and hypertrophy days. And then one group did open-ended and one group just did like a high volume power day. And then we could see whether or not more practice was better than better practice for the type of stuff we're talking about. So anyway, just an interesting idea. That's something that we often don't do. We auto-regulate load a lot. We'll even auto-regulate, frequency or what days we train. But rarely will you see like a quality-based auto-regulation of volume when the focus is like practice, which I think would be again, I do see it occasionally in weightlifting. I have had coaches who are just like, yep, shut it down. You're starting to look worse. Like we dropped load already and then you missed again. We're done. So I think that is relatively common in weightlifting, but I would be interested to see that model taken into powerlifting on the practice days. So yeah, Omar, I think that's the only thing I want to add. And so yeah, I think with that, we can close this sucker out. And I'm going to take it out of your hands, folks. You are not going to hear Omar closing us out. I'm going to ride this into the sunset. I've answered the last question. I will have the last word. So if you're listening, do us a favor. Hop on the iTunes, hop on the Spotify, click on the thumbs up on YouTube. But in the cases where you can actually give us a rating out of 5, like iTunes, make a decision, think long and hard, or you can just take the easy shortcut and listen to me and give us that 5 out of 5 rating. And we will see you next time, because you can always find Iron Culture every single Monday.